Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Done Deal. I say podcast, but it's also a visual cast. I don't know what. Anyway, podcast and visual stuff. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Murad Ahmed from the Financial Times. I've known Murad for a number of years now, only because he usually phones me up and picks my brain, and usually I don't know the answer to the question, so I have to go away and give it quite a lot of thought and come back with
And
something.
give you no notice. Call you at deadline, desperate for a quote.
But I think the truth is that you the quality of content that you're able to put out on the FT is, it's my go-to in a lot of ways for the real in-depth piece. You did an unbelievable piece. It's not unbelievable. It's a fantastic piece on, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, on COVID-19 generally and its impact on the sports landscape, which was awesome and must have taken a huge amount of time to do. And I read it two or three times because you can always find lots of interesting connections and crossovers in a lot of the stuff that I do. So it's amazing to have you on the podcast. As I said in the build-up, I feel a bit of a fraud because usually you're the one asking me the questions, and I'm just this fake journalist. I'm not even a journalist, someone that's just asking you a few bits. But what I really wanted to just delve into, even if it's just like for 15, 20 minutes, is just hearing from you a little bit of your story as to, from a life perspective rather than as much of a career perspective, how like you got going in the sports industry, the cool stuff that you do, the interesting stories that you've been involved with, and actually, as importantly, because we talk about it a lot as well, is how you balance life with career, which is a bit of a difficult one as well for me, and I'm just reaching out to lots of people in the sports world as well to hear about that. But if maybe first you could, even just for a few minutes, just talk about, like, was it always journalism for you when you were growing up? What did you want to be? How did you envisage your sort of future and future career?
Yeah, I would say my career is a series of happy accidents. I studied law at university and hated it. Sorry to say, just loathed it. And I was trying to actually get training contracts to do media law or sports law, but actually media law. And a lot of that would have been working for the other side, the people suing the newspapers, actually, and found out it wasn't for me. And I applied for traineeships in journalism. I was doing student journalism at the time, and it hadn't actually occurred to me that that could be a career. And on a whim, applied to the Times traineeship, the UK Times, and got it. It took a couple of years to get it, but I got a foot in the door, did work experience, did some. I did a journalism master's for training, and spent, I think, 8 years at the Times, going from a general reporter to covering mainly technology for most of my time there. And when I first started doing the tech job, I was the young brown guy who you could, the internet's a fad, get him to do that thing. And in that time, the iPad was released, Twitter came out, all of these big changes were happening, and Silicon Valley became the center of the business world. And it was a great story to cover. And I got noticed by the FT. The FT initially hired me to come over and cover technology for them, with a great pitch, which is for the FT, technology is a front page story, and it wouldn't be for the Times, and that is true. And I kind of jumped at the chance to move over to the FT. It's a fantastic paper, and like you were saying, I was spending a lot of time reading and reading the FT rather than anywhere else. And you slowly get to understand the culture of rigor, of accuracy. I mean, journalists get a bad press, and sometimes it's deserved, sometimes it's not. I actually think journalists do an amazing job of getting almost everything right, and the things that we do notice when they get it wrong get highlighted to a significant degree. But to the FT, that really, really is really important. So 2 sources on every fact, direct knowledge, don't assume things, don't editorialize is very key, and all of that. And that training was good. And then the next happy accident was just before the Rio Olympic Games. My colleague, who was a leisure correspondent, and this is the FT's very weird relationship with sport. The leisure correspondent used to cover the hotel industry, gambling, restaurants, cruise liners, all sorts of weird and wonderful things, but also sport and the business of sport. And whoever had the leisure correspondent's job was going to go to the Rio Olympics. And this poor guy was promoted out of the job he loved. And that job became vacant just before the Rio Games. I thought I'd absolutely love to do that, as I'm a sports nut. Got the job, went to Rio, and haven't looked back. The thing that has changed in the FT since I've taken over the role, it became more and more patently clear to my bosses that I was spending all my time on sport and very little time doing anything about the hotel industry. I pitched to them the idea that they should just start to split that off and have a good, instead of mediocre, leisure correspondent and somebody who and doing sport, which would be me. And we're slowly starting to actually expand that, because sport, football, has become a big money story involving more and more finance houses, billionaires, big money. Following that, I think, can be an FT speciality in a way that others can't do in the depth that we can do it, and being able to connect the worlds of high finance and sport is where we think we can have an advantage. So that's the storyline I've been trying to follow ever since.
And some of the other guys and girls I've been speaking to on podcast related matters as well, especially in sport, or I'm not sure whether it's obviously not just exclusive to sport, but it can sometimes be, in my experience, I know in your experience too, a little bit of a 24/7, 365 day experience, where it can be, and that's, I guess, one of the benefits and drawbacks of it becoming a bit all-consuming at different times, especially when particular stories hit or particular things really build the gravitas of a situation or a crisis or a positive story going on. At what point did you realize, or maybe you've always realized, that it was possibly going to be that way for you, where as soon as you realized that sport was going to be the thing you were going to be reporting on the most? And then how did you manage balancing that with general life commitments?
I think so. This is an issue of all news reporters. I think we all talk about, we have something called the fear, and the fear is there's a story out there somewhere that you're not getting, that somebody else is getting, that can land at any moment. When I was covering technology, I remember distinctly Steve Jobs died, and the announcement came out at about 1:30 a.m. UK time, and I was called up by the night news editor to say, you've got half an hour to wake up and file the front page story tomorrow. Go. So that's 400 words in a days, and that is just the life of a reporter. There are some stories that you have to jump on straight away, and if you wait, you miss it, and you can't miss it because it's news. In terms of how that affects day-to-day life, it affects it really badly. I won't lie. My wife isn't always delighted by the way this works. I think the key is just having that communication with your family, to make sure that they know that there are downtimes in the middle of that. I try to be very protective over holiday times, and I genuinely just turn off the screen. Have a pretty strict out of office, and what will be in that time. It also helps that I work for a very kind and humane organization, the FT. That people do try and allow you to have your weekends. There's a rota, which means that various different people have to cover a Sunday shift, and if you don't want to work on that Sunday, no one's going to force you. It's quite a good place to work in that sense. So it's just making sure that you build in downtime. I think knowing that is time that you're gonna switch off, but it is incredibly hard. During the lockdown, for example, it's got worse. If anything, there's no sport, and I've never been busier. You wake up at 7 and you're behind a laptop, and you kind of keep going until 7 p.m. And even then, there's more to do a lot of the time. So if it wasn't for the passion for the job, it'd be very, very hard. But it often doesn't feel like work, really. It's a pretty enjoyable existence. So I'm not going to complain too much.
Yeah, I feel the way a lot of the times. I mean, there's definitely been times I know during my career, and I haven't had the longest career just yet, maybe 15, 16 years in the legal industry, especially when you're working on football for long periods of time or sport, where the truth is the last thing you want to do is at the weekend turn the television on and watch another game of football.
Oh God, yeah.
So I remember going through a phase of not watching any football for maybe a couple of months and doing triathlons instead, which was great for a period of just and then realizing actually that you're in a pretty privileged position to be in the football industry, and you need to get over yourself and and move on a little bit. But I can empathize completely. I especially in this lockdown period now, I'm finding a lot of comfort in my routine of that getting up early, going into my front room, working, getting on with the day, trying to be creative with lots of things we're trying to do as well, and obviously help clients a bit. But it's not an easy time. And I think maybe the next bit that I was then going to mention is, the funny thing is I owe you a big debt of gratitude in a lot of ways, because it was around the time that my book was coming out a couple of years ago now, and I remember us chatting, and you were saying, maybe we'll do if you fancy a few quotes on your book coming out, and we'll see if we can get it in the newspaper at all. And then the next thing I know is a photographer comes to the office and takes a few pictures, and then we have a good chat as well. And I didn't know anything more than it. And then about 4 days later, I mean, I don't think my mum has been as happy ever when she sees a full page spread of her son in the Financial Times talking about sort of my career and stuff, which was amazing. So, I mean, if there was a good opportunity to be able to oversell something, that was definitely it. It was fantastic. And the thing that I think, going back to sort of career stuff generally, that I'm interested as well is, you go from lots of different sports generally. So it's not like just with me, I'm doing just football or otherwise. You find that difficult to handle different personality. I know it's saying different personalities within a sport, but generally within lots of different sports, to be able to handle the variety and the complexity and the nuance, and keeping a very broad idea about what's going on in the sector, but then being as laser focused on particular subjects within a particular sport. How do you manage to become so broad brush but also so specialist?
It's kind of you to say that I am. I tend to think that actually it's impossible to know every story very well. So one thing that's really important, you are not as smart as everyone else out there, and there is a vast amount of knowledge out there, and a lot of reporting is about talking to people. So whatever subject it is, if you are getting it from Twitter or just sitting down and writing and haven't spoken to anyone, you're probably going to do the dumb take on it. So you mentioned that big read. That was took a couple of weeks to do, but you just speak to 10, 15 people in the industry and you let them talk. You ask questions, you let them talk, and let that knowledge kind of filter into your brain. That's the best way of getting stories. It's also the best way of covering every angle. So I don't consider what I do as a kind of as my knowledge imparted to the reader. It's everybody else's. I'm a conduit to what other people's views are, and try and keep myself out of it. So as long as you're trying to do that, you can cover any subject, because you go and try and find the right people to talk to, and you tell their story. So I don't feel so. You just apply that across sport. Obviously, I can write a football story pretty fast these days because there's just a lot of inherent knowledge that I have. I'm currently writing a story about the proposed Newcastle United takeover, and I have done 10 or 15 of these stories in the past 3 or 4 years. And I know every nook and cranny, and I know where to look, and I know who to ask, and I've got people on speed dial, and I can do that. It gets harder when you're trying to do something like, which you kind of find interesting, like what's an example? The bloodstock industry in horse racing. I don't know anything about that. But what you do is you spend a week talking to loads of people, and they tell you what it is, and you listen. So that's the best way to do it. The other thing I tend to think is most most people have a stick or a way of analyzing the world. If you try to just do every sports story in the world, I think you do it really poorly. I think you got to know what you're good at. So I think what the FT is good at, not just me, is you follow the money. So we do the money story. I'm never going to get Jose Mourinho goes to Spurs faster than somebody who's really in with the Jose Mourinho crowd, or transfer stories. That isn't what we're going to be good at. But what we can do is takeovers better than anyone else. We can do the boardroom better than anyone else. We can analyze the money better than anyone else. And the other thing I think I've tended to be good at is the kind of the longer read storytelling, which takes a lot of time. It's about structure and pacing and how you tell a story over time. We've got better at that, and I don't necessarily think there are that many people who are doing it in the way we're doing it, because a lot of sports journalism is kind of opinion led, which is great. We all read it, but it's one person and almost always one guy's perspective on things. If you look at a lot of other reporting that's out there in any other subject, that isn't how it is. It isn't a commentary. It is a report based on what other people are saying. I think we can do that. You can do that approach to sports in a way that most other people aren't doing it.
And lastly, because obviously I don't want to take up too much of your time, and it's great just to chat more generally. How are you doing, and how is the reporting of stories doing for you in this period now of sort of lockdown and unprecedented changes to the way the world generally works as well? I mean, for my part, I'm trying to actually read the mainstream news less, to a degree, just for my own health and well-being, because mental health and well-being, because just watching death tickers and other types of things like that is just too upsetting, really, is the truth. And in a way, what I'm looking at is, I mean, I've never read as many science journals as the truth in the past about 3 or 4 weeks, where I'm just like looking at the latest antiviral clinical results and different things like that to try and look at the positives to see, hopefully, when things might change for the better. I've probably gone a bit too far about what I'm doing, but what I'm interested in, if you're able to explain, is, how has your job, if at all, changed, and how your reporting changed as a result of what is happening now? Obviously, loads of reactive things in sport, but has the focus shifted in any way as to what you are reporting and how you're saying it?
Yeah, well, for the journalism trade, a crisis is a good thing. There's nothing like a crisis to cover. Actually, financially, everyone's been affected, including the FT. Advertising's gone off a cliff, and we're all worried about that, and so on. But in terms of the job, basically, I've gone from covering a boom industry to covering a collapsing industry right in front of us within weeks. And there is an endless amount to say about that. So I thought things might slow down because if there isn't any sport, what's the storyline going to be? Well, what have we seen? We've seen the Premier League and the Professional Football Association and the English Football League get into an unbelievable public row over pay cuts. And that took up 2 weeks of my time. You've seen cancellations of the biggest sporting events in the world. You've and the kind of the inner workings of that, and now you're seeing how, which we always thought was going to happen, some big name sporting entities worried about going bust, and then there'll be a reopened story as well. So it's never been busier on this beat. I feel sorry for colleagues who make their living from doing match reports or particular. There's a type of sports journalism which is being completely ground down. But as a sports news correspondent, there is endless amounts of sports news. So that bit hasn't stopped. I, like you, have to find some way of turning off. Just before the lockdown, I bought Wolf Hall, and it's massive and it's compelling, and I read it at like 30 pages at a time because I read slowly, and it's a world away. And I haven't watched any football. I'm not watching any clips. I'm not watching any old reruns of sport. I find it a very weird thing to do. So I found a way of keeping away from it, and I find, like you, find a lot of this stuff depressing, but I'm in the news business, so I'm covering it pretty closely, and all those developments kind of have a knock-on effect on all the stories I'm writing too. So I've got to keep as best I can one step ahead of it.
Yeah, no, completely agree. And lastly, one of the questions you might have answered it already is, in this time of lockdown now, when you're trying to switch off from stuff, are there any interesting books you read lately? Any podcasts that you listen to? Any particular ways of you're consuming content on certain things that are either inspiring, interesting, sparking conversation, sparking new ideas? I'm always interested in just other people's views on what they're reading and doing generally.
Yeah, on sport or just generally?
Life, whatever. Philosophy.
Yeah. No, you know what? I think definitely what's happened is that I'm because there isn't action at the moment, I'm consuming a lot less just watching. I like you, I tend to watch fewer and fewer games. I actually end up going to about 12 to 15 games in a season. Anyway, I don't think you get a lot from being in the stadium a lot of the time, unless you're going to meet people. And the life of being in a press box isn't meeting people; it's watching the game and then having a take. And that's not something I do anyway. So all of that has been wiped away from me, and largely, I'm reading fiction again for the first time in absolutely forever. There's a lot of good TV, and I'm here with my wife and kid, which are, trying to do childcare for a 15, 16-month-year-old, while my wife is a civil servant, is also trying to help run the country, keeps you up. So it hasn't stopped being busy. I always used to say that going to football would be great if it wasn't for the fans. Getting in and out of a stadium is I found a tiresome chore. I just stopped dealing with it. But what I would give to go to a game now, I have to say, a month in, it'll be a great moment when we're all going back to a full stadium. That will be quite a thing, and I'm looking forward to it, because a lot of the stuff I had planned for this summer, the Euros, the Olympic Games, the stuff that you make a career out of has suddenly got wiped out. So I'm happy doing other stuff for now, but I'll be delighted when the sport gets turned back on.
Here, here. And I think on that note, yes, that's definitely going to be something to look forward to. Maybe not in the near future, but in the medium term, hopefully. So, mate, thanks so much for coming on and having a chat. And you can definitely get back to your childcare and day job now. So.
Oh no, I'm the day job is endless. Like Saudi Arabia is buying Newcastle United. Now that is an FT story.
I look forward to reading it, mate.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you later.
For your time. Take care.